Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. So, sige, habang inaayos natin yung ating PowerPoint. Nailagay ko na title ng talk for this morning is Engaging Local Knowledge for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I'd like to start with a story about the Moken of Thailand. Isa siyang indigenous peoples group. They reside within the islands of Surin in Thailand. And ang tawag sa kanila sa international community ay sila yung mga sea gypsies. Dahil naglalayan sila sa karagatan along the islands of Surin. Last December 26, 2004, there was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake that struck off the Indonesian island of Sumatra, and it triggered a tsunami that killed tens of thousands of people in the Indian Ocean coastal communities. There were several countries affected by this tsunami. I suppose many of you still remember that tsunami, no? So there were coastal communities in Sri Lanka, coastal communities in India, in Thailand, as well as in Indonesia. So in Thailand, the Moken, who were then serving as tourist guides for many of the tourists in the high-end tourist resort areas within the neighboring islands of Surin, they were able to save not only themselves, but the tourists as well. No? The narratives of survival among the Moken, who are known as the sea gypsies of Thailand, involved a legend. So they had the legend of the seven rollers and the legend of the laboon. The laboon is a local term they use for a big wave. And it comes in series. Kaya seven rollers yung tawag nila sa legend na yan. So it's part of the oral tradition of the Moken, passed orally from generation to generation. So there is no written account about this legend. The legend involves not only signs that inform the Moken about an impending tsunami, but sites within their areas, where they live, where they could run for safety. So the tourist guides, the Moken tourist guides, brought the tourists there, and so they were saved from the tsunami. So this incident underscored the importance of local knowledge in DRR, and it actually paved the way for international agencies, organizations to focus or to turn their gaze into local knowledge and how it could be tapped for disaster risk reduction. Okay? So, important yung story, yung narrative ng Moken. Okay. So in anthropology, we look at cultures of disaster. Now, by cultures of disaster, we don't necessarily mean na disaster-prone yung culture na yun. I think there's a popular definition na ginagamit, nagsisirculate ngayon when we talk about cultures of disaster, disaster-prone, no? But in anthropology, by cultures of disaster, we refer to the study of the life experiences of people faced with constant threats from hazards and how they're able to incorporate appropriate and effective responses to these threats in their daily lives. Because remember that hazards are part of the everyday lives of people. With or without people in an area, the hazards will be there. So people have developed ways and means to cope with these hazards. The UNISDR has shown that long before we came up with modern technology-based early warning systems or standard operating procedures for response, numerous local communities worldwide have already prepared, operated, acted, and responded to disasters using their own indigenous methods that have been passed on from one generation to the next. So, meron na sila mga existing ways. No? And there have been many anecdotal references that have been published in journals and books as well, showing that people can predict impending earthquakes or cyclones by observing natural signs in their environment. And this can be found in their ideas or concepts of animal behavior, changes in the characteristics of groundwater, as well as groundwater sources, abnormal weather phenomena, and all these are part of what we call as local knowledge. Yeah. So, siguro it's important to provide a definition of local knowledge. No? So, local knowledge has been used, the term local knowledge has been used alternatively with other terms. We have indigenous knowledge, sa literature to, no? There's also folk knowledge, traditional knowledge, people's science, IPK or indigenous and traditional knowledge. Links is the term used by UNESCO, no? Or local and indigenous knowledge systems. Yeah. All of these have been part of what we traditionally in anthropology study as ethnoscience. In ecological anthropology, we've been studying ethnoscience, and part of that include disaster or hazard mitigation and knowledge referring to hazards. So Mercer has defined local knowledge as a body of knowledge that exists within or acquired by local people. So important to note here is that it is localized. Okay? And it has been existing over a period of time, so the temporal context is also vital in the definition of local knowledge. And it has been derived through accumulation of experience, society-nature relationships, community practices, and institutions, and it has been passed down from generation to generation. So yun yung characteristics ng local knowledge. It incorporates knowledge that frames people's understanding of a hazard and their environment. So how people react, how people will respond to a hazard depends upon their local knowledge and understanding of their environment. So the culturally appropriate ways of responding to such hazards are embodied in local knowledge. The way people also define a disaster defines the way they look for solutions and what they even consider to be a solution. So for those involved in program planning, an understanding of local knowledge would better inform the way they program disaster risk reduction measures. Local knowledge is also dynamic. Contrary to how others look or view local knowledge as being static and rigid, it is dynamic in nature. It can change, and it is continually influenced by internal creativity, and innovation, as well as experimentation and contact with external systems. So hindi siya as if yun na yung nature niya since time immemorial. There are other elements of local knowledge that have transformed through time, and that does not mean that they can no longer be considered as local knowledge. So recognizing local knowledge in DRR is important because it is the lens through which people perceive the world and their lives in that world. So it guides their behavior and how they will react or respond to hazards within an environment. And DRRM programs have to take this into account for designing better coping strategies at the local level. Ben Wisner, in a 2009 conference on disaster, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Atlanta, identified several important features of local knowledge. First of all, it is social, or it is shared by a group of people in a community. It is not entirely traditional, so again, yung nature ng local knowledge shows that hindi lang lahat ay galing sa mga ninuno pa natin, no? Because nga of its characteristic that it can transform through time. It is also opportunistic, so you see, it can change, and it will change, to incorporate versions of outside specialist knowledge when it sees that it is important for the group of people's survival as well. So it can be what the literature will call as in a hybrid state of knowledge. Yun yung term na ginagamit sa literature, hybrid. Because of, and I'll give you examples later on. And because of the mobility of the bearers of local knowledge, it's not as if these are isolated communities, no? May ilan pa malamang na mga isolated communities. But many of our communities are already exposed to other forms of knowledge. So the tendency is to mix or hybridize knowledge, and this tendency is increasing. Within a community, local knowledge is not uniformly distributed. There are specialized forms of local knowledge, like fishing, for instance, in agriculture, midwifery, building or construction of houses. So, meron din mga forms of local knowledge that are available only to certain groups of people. It is also gendered and age-graded. So there are certain forms of knowledge that only the women will know. So part ito ng tinatawag natin na specialist knowledge. And also, other forms of knowledge are only for the elders. Yan. So, merong ganitong nature ang local knowledge. It varies according to the standpoints of people in different life situations. It is also a source of power and status. That's why the maestro in a fishing community will be very much respected and revered because he holds the knowledge of the sea and the power, therefore, to harness effectively resources from that environment. Isang example yon. Or healers. Yeah, they're also very much respected in their communities. It may, to a Western trained or oriented specialist, local knowledge may appear to have no basis or efficacy. And in my own experience, I've encountered some other specialists who say na, oh, let's not include what are merely superstition. yung mga na-encounter ko in some of my engagement with technical experts. Okay. Minsan napapaaway din. Napapaaway din kami dyan. So, lastly, local knowledge is maybe tacit knowledge, no? Like the knowledge of the Moken on the legend of the Seven Rollers, hindi siya written. So they are merely articulated part of the oral literature of groups of people. So I'll give you now some examples, no, of local knowledge that have been documented in the literature. Actually, if you do a search of local knowledge used in the RR, madami na rin mga naisulat. So it's not a new thing, although yung application ang medyo kailangan pa natin i-push, no? Yeah. So, in explaining the hazard, there are a lot of ways in which people explain hazards. They're seen as acts of God, wages of sin, no? Notions of morality. Parang kasi hindi masama ka kasi, kaya nangyayari sa'yo yung mga disaster na yan. I remember in a field work we did in one of the provinces in the southern Philippines. There was a group of people na natabunan sila ng mud flow during rain. So na-wipe out yung isang sitio ng barangay na yon, no? And the ones in the neighboring barangays were saying na ay kaya sila natabunan kasi kulto sila. They have formed their own religious group, no? Parang splinter group from the mainstream Catholic religion. And so, nung nangyari yun, sabi nila kasi daw, kulto yun, no? So, maraming mga references to the supernatural which you will find in local knowledge. I'll give you more specific examples later on, no? So, predicting the onset of a hazard, many references are to animal behavior, position of the stars, the clouds, and other heavenly bodies, observation of plants, and agricultural and fishing calendars. They do have their own agricultural and fishing calendars that inform people about the ideal time to plant and when to harvest. For fishing, ganun din, no? Kailan dapat pumalaot at kailan hindi dapat pumalaot. Okay, so ito yung mga examples ng animal behavior. In one community we went to, sabi gano'n, nagpupulasan daw yung mga ahas at mga daga. Yan. Pulasan yung term na ginamit nila. So, naglalabasan yung mga yan. Unusual yung behavior ng mga animals. So, that is an indicator na may darating na earthquake, pagsabog ng bulkan, o kaya may malaking bagyong darating. Kasi iba yung na-notice nila na behavior ng mga hayop. So, in Bicol, the fishers have a way of looking at the rays of the sun. Rayon yung term na ginagamit. Noong una hindi ko maintindihan, ano yung rayon? Yung pala yung rays of the sun yung kanilang nire-refer doon. So, yung direction ng rays of the sun is also a sign na kailangan na nilang bumalik. Bumalik sa shore dahil babagyo na. Padating na yung malakas na bagyo. And of course, the character of the clouds. Yan. So, they have their own ways of predicting or forecasting hazards that are forthcoming. Cultural responses involve so many aspects also. Cultural responses to the hazard or the disaster. Like in the area of material culture, housing construction has been designed to be resilient to the hazards that are specific to environments, as well as technological innovations. Okay, the Ibatan house is said to be a resilient structure. It's made of boulders, small boulders, and the roof is thatched. Pero medyo may ano na ngayon, no? Kasi may pagbabago na sa mga housing styles in Batanes. The more recent households have reverted to the hollow blocks and yero na bubong. Yan. Ang kwento was that the typhoons, nung nandun kami, nung nandun yung mga estudyante namin, ang kwento sa kanila ng mga tao ay nag-migrate na daw yung bagyo. Kasi hindi na sila masyadong dinadaanan compared with the previous times. Yun. Sabi, ma'am, nung nandun kami, siguro mga several years ago, sabi ng mga tao sa amin, nag-migrate na yung bagyo sa Mindanao. Mindanao naman daw nagpunta. Yun. And aside from that, no, kaya medyo hindi na din masyadong ganito yung construction ng houses in Batanes. Yung paggamit ng boulders, yung mga small boulders, kinukuha nila yan sa Balugan, the Boulder Beach in Batanes. Pinagbawal na ng local government yung paggamit ng mga boulders doon. Baka daw maubos na yung kanilang beach. So, kaya medyo may pagbabago na sa mga housing styles ngayon. Houses on stilts. Traditionally, Filipino houses were on stilts, and hindi lang yan imbakan ng mga agricultural animals nila like chickens, pigs, but it's also protection against flooding. So, mas resilient yung ganong houses. Technological innovations. So, this tricycle, I chanced upon it during Ondoy in Pasig. So, nung pumunta kami post-Ondoy, sabi ng mga tao na nakausap namin, ma'am, naka-high heel yung kanilang ride. Yan. So, yan that was what was able to transport people from area to area within Pasig City during the floods. And of course, the picture on the right is a household rain gauge. Ginagamit yan sa Bicol. Okay, so pwede naman, di ba? So these are all part of innovations and local knowledge. So religion, there's a very strong narrative of religion in the people's engagement with their environment. Like for instance, the Nuestra Señora de Salvacion in Horoan, Tiwi Albay, Apo na Malyari among the Aitas of Mount Pinatubo. So sila yung mga, the Nuestra Señora de Salvacion from her name itself, Our Lady of Salvation. Siya yung i-recognize na patron na during disasters. And hindi lang yung mga natural disasters na na-encounter ng mga tao doon, kundi pati yung personal disasters na na-encounter ng mga tao in their own lives. Yan. So, may mga pilgrimages sa kanila. The Apple na Malyari has been, yung devotion to the Apple na Malyari had been evident during the Mount Pinatubo explosion. And what's quite interesting about that was that there was a mix of the traditional rituals of the Aita and the icon or the image of the Virgin Mary, because Apple na Malyari is a Virgin Mary. Yan. So, oo, kahit Apo yung tawag. So this incorporates the strong narrative of the people's engagement with the supernatural and their natural worlds. Okay? Ito yung image ni Nuestra Señora de Salvacion. Ito yung reputo outside her shrine. Yan. So, pero yung mismong icon nasa loob ng shrine. Yan. So in terms of social organization, there's the practice of pagpapadagos in Albay. Recently in the news I heard, hindi lang households to, no? Ang practice kasi ng pagpapadagos ay yung mga pamilya na may mga matitibay na bahay sa Albay, tuwing may bagyo na malakas, yun ang nagiging evacuation center ng mga kapitbahay nila. Kasi pinapatuloy nila yan, no? Whether relative nila o hindi, their houses are open to anyone who wishes to take refuge in their homes. Just this morning, I learned from the news that a hotel owner opened his hotel to community members. Yan. Kasi nga, sasabog ang Mount ngayon. No? So, ito yung practice nila ng pagpapadagos, which is, has been the practice in Albay for a long, long time already. In Ticopia, one of the island states in the Pacific, they have the traditional message runners. So, pagka bagyuhan kasi, nawawala ng kuryente sa kanila, no? So, those who have battery-run radios, they listen to the news. And then, they spread the news to their neighbors using the traditional message runners. So, ito, traditional way of disseminating information in the Ticopia. Yeah. Cultural values are part of local. So, bayanihan, recently in Yolanda, na-highlight yung practice ng bayanihan. In Bicol, they have the concept of the oragon. Ayan. May mga Bicolano ba sa audience natin? May palang Bicolano. Okay, so mga oragon kayo, no? So, ang oragon kasi is the idea that you are strong, you are wise, and this has been very effective in strengthening the spirit of the Bicolanos amidst trials like the natural hazards that they encounter. Yun. So, ibig sabihin, pag oragon ka, kaya mo yan. And it has been a rallying cry behind them to push them to face the hazard and syempre may downside din yan. I'll tell you about that later. To push themselves to rise above the predicament of post-disaster. Yan. Pagtatarabangan, pagtutulungan, no? It's similar to bayanihan in Bicol. Bahala na was described by Greg Bankoff in one of his articles. According to Bankoff, it refers to strategies for dealing with the emotional and psychosocial requirements of living with uncertainty. No, so kailangan mo ng crutch, something like a crutch, no, pagkakapitan para hindi ka mag-breakdown afterwards. So maybe from psychology, marami na ding mga pag-aaral tungkol dito. So part of that is bahala na. O ang sinasabi ng ipagaling daw ito sa bathala na, you know, good words niya. folklores, legends, myths, oral literature, including traditional knowledge systems such as fishing, the legend of the seven rollers, they are all part of what we call as local knowledge. Okay. Now, there is a legal and policy framework for incorporating local knowledge in the RRM programs. So RA 10121, or the DREAM Act, mentions in Section 2 that PRR and climate change measures should be gender responsive, sensitive to indigenous knowledge systems, and respectful of human rights. So, meron tayong batas na nagsasabi na dapat i-recognize natin itong indigenous knowledge systems na ito. Sige. Pero ginagawa nga ba talaga? So, yun yung kailangan natin pagtuunan ng pansin. Apparently, kulang. Kung ginagawa man, kulang yung efforts because there is an evident gap between practices and policy. So, the need to bridge the gap with adequate recognition of the domain of LK and local coping capability is urgent. UNESCO, I think, has mentioned this, na kailangan gawin na natin now na. No? Dahil kulang naman yung resources talaga. Lalo pat kung sunod-sunod yung hagupit ng mga bagyo at yung mga hazards na na-encounter, it really depletes the resources of the community and the nation. So we can tap local knowledge which is already existing in communities for DRR measures. Yan. So kailangan mag-dialogue pa. May mga efforts na to bring DRRM workers and planners who are mostly technical people, engineering people, to sit down and talk with people to share local knowledge. Maybe Dr. Luna and Professor Cadag will share with you their experiences. No? So ano ba yung mga challenges and recommendations in mainstreaming local knowledge in DRR? Hindi na naman puro challenge. There are namang mga ways to address the challenge. For one, sa sarili ko din experience, talking with some people, may difficulty din for science to recognize local knowledge because local knowledge is contextualized and does not allow standardization. So in the RRM planning, for instance, the top-down approach kasi is still dominant. So, nandun sa taas yung mga plano, and then it's brought down to the local level. Pero kung ganun yung approach, paano yung contextualization, di ba? So, medyo may ganung system pa until now. So, bringing science to the grassroots needs a localized context. Local knowledge is a viable vehicle for this. Okay. Using the holistic perspective, DRR intervention specialists are usually outsiders, not from the local community, and they're not privy to local knowledge. Therefore, interventions implemented usually focus on the hazard alone. So, kumbaga, anong solution ang binibigay? Building of dikes, building of mega bridges, yung mga ganon. Well, with local knowledge, the focus shifts away from the hazard alone. So, hindi lang hazard ang tinitignan, pero kasama pa rin ang hazard doon. And is broadened to cover the wider culture that includes social, political, and economic concerns of a group of people. So, the top-down diffusion of knowledge and practice requires fine-tuning to suit local conditions. At the local scale, people experience threats in a more holistic way kasi. Okay? So, poverty, continuation pa rin ito, violence, climate change, disasters, and many hazards confront people equally. So, ang concern nila, hindi lang yung hazard. There are so many other concerns of equal importance to them in their everyday lives, in environments where they work, they live, they raise their children, they celebrate, and they suffer. See? So medyo malawak. No? Mas malawak sa concern ng DRRM. Yan. Local efforts to deal with one of these challenges generally involve dealing with the others as well. Okay? So DRR interventions have to be designed as a development strategy that incorporates components covering other aspects of human daily lives. So in other words, there has to be a comprehensive program of which DRRM is a component. So hindi siya solo flight, kumbaga, na intervention measure. There has to be an integrative community development program that involves disaster risk reduction and management. Kasi parte nga ito, no, ng kabuuang concern ng mga tao at the local level. Okay. So validation of local knowledge. Marami lang nagawang mga validation. There have been success stories in local knowledge validation that can be found in the literature, like the use of GIS and hazard mapping in many communities. Traditional use of poisons in fishing in Australia. Meron na din mga validation. Ibig sabihin, napatunay na may basis based on Western science. Ang suggestion ko lang is to do this with caution kasi hindi lahat ay mababalidate. And when this happens, hindi mabalidate yung ibang forms of local knowledge, it may result to tension. No? It may build tension between groups of specialists. Pero may mga success stories din yan. So, the sustainability of local knowledge under a changed environment, no, both natural environment and the built environment, sabihin, meron ng mga buildings, kabahayan, at iba pang structures doon. In extreme weather events, may be challenged. Disaster results, no, when there's a lack of mutuality between people and their environment. Local knowledge that evolved in previous environments may have to be adjusted, adapted, or reconstituted in new and changed environments. Sa ilang lugar na napuntahan ko, like in Batangas, for instance, sinasabi nila na nabago na yung kanilang agricultural calendar. Kasi nga, yung rainy season, they're already experiencing typhoons in December, which they never did in the past. So, binibiro nga nila ako kasi yung dissertation ko was on the seasonality in Batangas, and sabi nila, the peak of the typhoon season is August. So, meron silang term na ginagamit doon, ina-Agosto. So, pag ina-Agosto, talagang grabe yung impact sa kanila ng mga bagyo. So, sabi nila nung nag-visit ako recently, ma'am, gusto na namin palitan. Gagawin na daw nilang dinidisyembre kasi December na yung worst typhoons na nai-encounter nila. No? Yeah. Pero, I learned from the meteorologists that August pa rin daw yung pinaka-madami on a general, general level na typhoon sa ating bansa. Yeah. But there are microclimates kasi. So, siguro that accounts for the dinidisyembre. There's also accommodation in local knowledge, what the literature has called hybrid knowledge or contextualizing science in local knowledge. So madami ng evidences din for this, like the use of wayang puppetry for volcanic hazard information dissemination in Yogyakarta. So after the eruption of Merapi, ginamit nila yung wayang to disseminate technical knowledge on volcanic eruptions. Yun. The radio message runners among the people of Ethiopia, yung minention ko kanina. So they use the radio, which is a more modern contraption, but they use the traditional message runners to disseminate the information from the radios. The Pilatun among the Ibatans. The Pilatun is a household activity calendar, but it's traditional to the Ibatans, but it makes use of the Western horoscope. So, ang basis nun is Cancer, Libra, Virgo, yung gano'n, no? But it informs the people of Ivatan on whether they will plant or not, or iba pang mga household activities nila, but not their fishing activity. folk religion and Catholicism among the Aita. Yun nga yung kinikwento ko kanina, na may mga rituals sila in front of the Virgin Mary. Okay, ito, nakita ko to sa social media, in Facebook. So, kasi normally we refer to our body, di ba, pag may mga baha. So, ginagamit na din nila yan, ini-standardize nila. Kung hanggang tuhod, 19 inches pala yan, no, of flooding already. So, ginagamit na ng NNPA. Yan. Kasi, di ba tayo, hanggang saan na yung baha? Hanggang tuhod. Yan. Ang comment ko nga lang is, kaninong tuhod yung ating gagawing reference point dahil baka mamaya iba-iba tayo ng level ng tuhod. Okay. So, how do we move forward using local knowledge? First of all, we recognize local knowledge is a valuable source of knowledge that it provides solutions, not just alternative solutions, no? To improve development planning for policymakers and practitioners on the RRM, and it gives deeper insight to planners and programmers on how to implement the RRM measures. It should be made part of a comprehensive strategy that has to be designed for a more culture-sensitive and contextualized DRRM. Kasi minsan napaka-alien sa mga tao ng mga concepts na pinapatupad at the local level. So, part or component of a broader community development program. Maybe for the long term, no? Ito yung mahalaga na maipatupad. Siyempre may mga stopgap measures din naman tayo. And I'd like to see the documentation and study of local knowledge to be continued in various cultural contexts. While a lot have already been written, a lot are still waiting to be documented, as well as their dynamism in changing environments. Local knowledge is evolving to accommodate an evolving environment. And I'd be very much interested to see how urbanization, industrialization, as well as hazards, no, have challenged the sustainability of local knowledge. How it has adopted, what people are changing, for instance, in the local knowledge, what they are holding on to, and why. See? So, yun ang medyo kulang pa. Okay? Also, I see a need to look into the politics of aid and its impact on people's values, local knowledge, and resilience to disasters. May ilang reports na rin and studies on the political economy of aid, and they revealed how aid erodes the cultural values that have kept people resilient to hazards for the longest time. In one of the local government units I went to, and we did feedback of our study on community capacity, and resilience. Ang sabi sa amin ng mayor, huwag mong sasabihin sa amin yan, no, that they have resilient measures existing already which can be tapped for DRM. Pero when I asked him why, ang sabi niya sa amin, kasi hindi na darating ang tulong sa amin. So you see, part of the political economy of aid. No? And also to explore further ways of collaboration between local knowledge and other sciences and engineering. These are not mutually exclusive worlds. You know, there are always spaces for collaborative efforts. Ang caution ko lang din dito is to ensure that ethical standards in engaging local and indigenous peoples are adhered to. We do not want piracy of knowledge to happen. Okay? So, I'd like to end with a few quotes from my favorite authors. One from Anthony Oliver Smith, who is a known disaster scholar in anthropology. He said that the intimate relationship between people and the natural world form the foundation of their resilience in the face of hazards. And Greg Bankoff, who by the way is a historian, but has written a lot on the social construction of disasters, said that hazards are part of nature, but disasters may not always be so. So, thank you very much.